Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for coming to today's webinar on dollars and development in the late Cold War. My name is Ben Coates. I am an associate professor of history at Wake Forest University, where I study and teach primarily on topics of legal history and U.S. empire. I'm joined today by two of my co-editors from the Cornell University Press series, The United States and the World, as well as Professors David Johnson-Lee and David Wight, who will be discussing their new books from the series with us. So before we start, I'd like to introduce my colleagues from the series. Emily, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Emily Conroy-Krutz. I'm an associate professor at Michigan State University, where I work on religion and foreign relations, mostly in the 19th century. So my first book, Christian Imperialism, came out with the series in 2015, and it has been my delight to join the editorial board in the past few years.
Thanks. Paul?
I'm Paul Kramer at Vanderbilt University. I teach transnational history and the history of U.S. empire with an emphasis on race, gender, and immigration.
Great, thank you. Well, so what we'll do is I will introduce each of our panelists and give them 5 to 7 minutes to give us an overview of their books. And then we'll open up the floor to questions. And I have some, if we have the chance, I'll do that as well. So first we have David Johnson-Lee, who teaches US and Latin American history in Philadelphia. He earned his PhD from Temple University in 2015 and has published articles in urban history, among other places. Today, he will be talking about his new Cornell book, The Ends of Modernization, Nicaragua and the United States in the Cold War Era. So I would try to make this informal and use first names, but since both of our speakers are named David, I will refer to them as Dr. Lee and Dr. Wight. So Dr. Lee, would you like to give us a brief overview of the book?
Yeah, absolutely. So if I go over time, please stop me because you know how it goes. So basically, I'll give you a rundown of the kind of genesis of the project and the methodology I used and try to illustrate some of the main ideas I try to bring out in the book. So I began, of course, with an interest in trying to understand US power in the Western Hemisphere and in the global South in general, especially wanting to understand how that power was understood in the global South. And right, so of course, this is coming out of a decade of scholarship on modernization theory and development concepts. And I wanted to see how those concepts were understood and applied in places like Nicaragua. And so the first place I would, and the kind of first archival research I did was on the 1972 earthquake. This, of course, takes place immediately after what we think of as the kind of heyday of modernization. But what I discovered in researching the reconstruction process was that, well, first, that there were a lot of concepts that shared in common from the earlier era, even though the Nixon administration was no friend of these ideals of modernization. But then I also discovered a concept that the concept of decentralization, which was actually really key to this reconstruction process. And I associated it with the much later development era of neoliberalism. But what I saw was that this concept played a really important role in organizing this process of reconstruction. And so what I wanted to do, what I did was look at how these different actors understood this concept in practice. The Nixon administration understood basically that, right, their foremost interest was in building up this allied regime in Latin America, and decentralization was in a way in line with the Nixon doctrine of devolving power to its often dictatorial allies. Then the Somoza administration, actually, the Somoza regime in Nicaragua, saw this as a means of building their own dictatorial power and used this as a way of increasing their control over Nicaragua's countryside and over its urban spaces. But then finally, and most interestingly, I saw that even for the opposition to the Somoza regime, they picked up on the ideal of decentralization and tried to essentially hold accountable the United States and the Somoza administration for these proclaimed ideals of devolving power onto the local population. And so what ensued basically was there was a brief moment of consensus around this process of development, which then quickly, right, once once the reality on the ground came to be visible, right, this corrupt and destroyed city that was not actually fixed by this reconstruction process, this actually turned many of these at one point allies of the United States against the United States and against the Somoza regime, leading to the revolutionary era to come in 1979. So the chapters that follow a similar sort of model where I try to find key concepts that organize this process of development and organize this kind of exchange between Nicaragua and the United States. And I do argue, right, of course, Nicaragua is not unique in many ways, right? These concepts are being applied in a lot of places, but Nicaragua plays an outsized role, I argue, partly because of the willingness of Nicaraguans themselves to try to engage with these concepts and turn them to their own interests in a way. And so some of the concepts that I look at following this are, right, of course, immediately after the Nixon administration, human rights becomes a major policy in the United States, but I argue that it's accompanied by another less well understood concept, and this is basic human needs. And so the human rights doctrines were in a way a sort of check on the power of these dictatorships like the Somozas, but basic human needs doctrine actually served as a sort of revised form of counterinsurgency. And so these concepts do a kind of double duty, one of them serving to check the power of these US allies, but another simultaneously trying to still promote this kind of anti-communist counterinsurgency doctrine. And then following that, I look at the concept of pluralism, which again is a concept that I didn't associate at all with the eras of revolution in Latin America, but right, we associate this with systems of American government, ideals of democracy, separation of powers and things like that. But it turned out in the 1970s that pluralism was actually really important for socialists in Latin America. Salvador Allende, for instance, calling for ideological pluralism, trying to argue for a coexistence of socialist and capitalist models of development. This is really important for the Nicaraguan Revolution in bringing together an extremely diverse cast of characters, people who all oppose the Somoza regime, but have very different ideas about what's to follow. And so this ideal of pluralism was very important for organizing the revolution. But then when the Reagan administration comes along, it becomes a key concept for organizing the counter-revolution. And we can maybe talk more about this in the discussion, but European socialists actually play a really important kind of intermediary role in initially supporting the revolution, but then becoming quasi-partisans of the counter-revolutionary efforts of the Reagan administration. So that's the basic outline of my methodology in trying to study these concepts as, in a way, coming out of this original paradigm of modernization, but also fragmenting and being fragmented by the process of contestation that comes from Nicaragua and other actors around the world. Other key concepts I look at are issues like indigenous autonomy, sustainable development, the concept of concertación. This is a particularly Latin American concept, very important in the neoliberal period in the 90s. And then ultimately, so the first chapter of my book is the last one I wrote, but this looks at the concept of integration, right? Economic and political integration that is, of course, fundamental to this ideal of modernization, but is highly contested because, of course, what does this mean in practice? What does this mean for the power of the United States? What does this mean for the power of Latin American actors themselves? And so I argue that this concept of integration it isn't as self-evident as what it seems to mean, which would mean just kind of being pulled into the orbit of the United States, but could actually mean quite different things to different actors. So that's a quick and dirty rundown. We can talk more about it in the discussion.
Perfect. Thank you. And that was right on time.
Okay.
Yeah. So our next presenter and our next David is David M. Wight, who is visiting assistant professor at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro, where he has taught since 2017. He earned his PhD in 2014 from the University of California at Irvine, and he's held postdoctoral positions at Dartmouth University and Harvard. He has published articles in journals, including Diplomatic History and History and Memory. And today he will be talking to us about his new book, Oil Money, Middle East Petrodollars and the Transformation of US Empire, 1967 to 1988.
Thank you. Yeah, and so oil money, the basic genesis for it was trying to figure out what were the impacts of petrodollars or oil money, the revenues earned from the sale of oil by major oil exporters in the Middle East and their relationship with the United States. And I wanted to look at this not just from an economic standpoint, but from a geopolitical one, a cultural one. And so I use a range of sources from official records from the US government, the British government, IMF, World Bank, captured records of Saddam Hussein's regime, but also corporate and personal collections, economic data, and also importantly, different cultural news media sources, not just from the United States, but also from the Arab world and from Iran. And what I found as I researched is that petrodollars get into quite a bit of different things in US Middle East relations, how the United States wields power in the Middle East and also globally. And I argue that petrodollars facilitates a transition in the form of US power or empire, both in the Middle East and the larger world. That before the 1970s, the primary purpose of the Middle East within systems of US power was to provide cheap oil. That ends with the oil shock of 1973, but it gets replaced by the Middle East as being a source of petrodollars for projects that are seen as mutually beneficial by US elites and Middle Eastern elites, particularly in the monarchies of Iran and Saudi Arabia. And so these take the form of military buildups. These take the form of modernization engineering projects. This takes the form of large investments, bank deposits in Western firms to buy up debt, increase the capacity of the US government to fund itself increasingly from petrodollars. And so this establishes a new, important, in some ways larger role for the Middle East and its allies for the United States. But there's also a backlash to this, both in the United States and the Middle East. And this is where many of the cultural sources come to the fore. You see both defenders of this new petrodollar order on both sides of the relationship, arguing that this is a new era of cooperation between the two regions, that this is mutually beneficial, that it's going to boost the economies, the welfare, the peace of the world. It's beneficial in a Cold War context, but you see many others who strike what we might now call an anti-globalization or anti-Americanization narrative, peoples in the Middle East, but also Americans who are voicing fears that the United States is going to be bought up by Arabs, or that Arab and Iranian influence will subvert US government or major US corporations to the detriment of foreign policy goals or national interests or the American character writ large. And in the Middle East, you see kind of parallel or mirror arguments, concerns by many Arabs on the left and also Islamists who were concerned that the United States was getting undue influence in the region through these petrodollar projects. And one of the most prominent examples of this was the Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, who uses very populist anti-Americanization arguments about how Americans are stealing Iranian petrodollars and using them to promote imperialism, to kill Iranians. And this becomes a key narrative in the Iranian Revolution, which I argue is one of the most, is the largest anti-US petrodollar-led backlash that we see during the era. Now, ironically, this contributes to a doubling down, a strengthening of petrodollar ties between Saudi Arabia and the United States to counter Iran. And this sets up many of the dilemmas or paradoxes that go into the present day in US Middle East relations. Very strong economic and political ties between the United States and the Arab monarchies, but also fierce hostility between the United States and Iran, and also many Arab Islamists and secular leftists. So persisting issues into the present. So that's the whirlwind tour, and happy to dive into any of those aspects or completely different ones into greater detail in the Q&A.
Great, thank you. So just as a reminder for the audience, you're welcome to enter questions at any time. If I've done my Zoom correctly, the chat is not available to you, but the Q&A should be. So feel free to pose questions in the Q&A at any time. And in the meantime, I have a couple of questions of my own. The first thing that came to mind, and one reason I thought it was so interesting to read these two books together, is for what they might tell us about sort of the nature of the American empire. Because we've got, from the question of power, we've got two different poles. On the one side, you have these very wealthy petrostates. On the other side, you have Nicaragua, which is relatively poor even by Central American standards. So I guess a general question for both of you, what do you think your book does sort of reveal about the workings or the nature of the American empire? And then I'll ask a specific question for each. For Dr. Wight, I wonder if you could say more. You sort of reference in the book the idea of an interdependent empire, an empire of interdependence. And it's a fascinating concept because on its surface, we tend to think of empire as about dependence and hierarchy and domination. So how do you develop in the book ways in which you can have an empire that's based on interdependence? And for Dr. Lee, for Nicaragua, do you see, where is the opportunities for Nicaraguan actors to kind of push back against American power and perhaps even at times, force, or are there instances where the U.S. government is unable to get what it wants in the country? So Dr. Wight, if you want to go ahead and start.
Yeah, thank you for those questions. I would say that one of the things I'm striving to do in the book is to demonstrate how empire can be both interdependent and also cooperational, that there are reasons for Arab and Iranian elites to kind of opt into US empire, even as they seek to have greater autonomy or influence within it. And so there's been a lot of great scholarship that has kind of demonstrated the greater degree of agency or power of, say, the Shah of Iran or other Middle East actors who are US allies, and showing that they weren't just pawns of the US government. And I think that's true. And I try to demonstrate the agency of US allied leaders in the region as well. But I also want to kind of bring back to attention the fact that even if these are sometimes leaders in Iran or Saudi Arabia that push the United States in directions that maybe they'd rather not have to deal with, or that they had more freedom to maneuver or autonomy, that they still in many ways are serving US global power, and they're still augmenting US power. And that we'd not lose sight of that. So there was stakes for both of these sides to be engaged with each other, and they both benefit. But ultimately, it does extend US power, whether, again, kind of shoring up US financial systems, private and public, or providing aid to groups such as the Contras in Nicaragua under Reagan, where the Congress has said you can't fund these, so the Reagan administration looks to the Saudis primarily to bankroll this as well. It's a way for the United States to extend its power in cases where it might not be able to do so on its own, either because of foreign policy concerns or even domestic constraints.
So does it make sense, just to follow up really quickly, to see, for instance, Saudi Arabia and Iran under the Shah as allies of the American empire, or as part of the American empire? Or is that a useful distinction at all?
I mean, I guess to my mind, they're both. Again, as I'm kind of thinking about empire or imperial systems, one doesn't have to be a complete dependency to be part of American empire. I'm more thinking of it in terms of if you're contributing to and augmenting U.S. power, then you're part of the American empire.
Great, thanks. So Dr. Lee, what do things look like from the Nicaraguan perspective?
Okay, sure. So, right, of course, in Latin American history, empire is a major concept in trying to understand U.S. power in the region. Of course, the classic understanding is that the United States has these profound economic interests in the region, and that shapes U.S. policy there, which of course is true in many cases, but Nicaragua is a special case because, of course, the United States has as deep and sometimes deeper ties than many other places there. But in terms of economic interests, those are few and far between, except for some vague fantasies about building another canal there, which nobody ever believed would happen. But then, right, more recently, I think probably the most important understanding of empire, Greg Grandin's Empires Workshop, argues kind of the opposite, that empire becomes important in Latin America, not because of its essential nature to US security interests or anything like that, but because it's expendable, and it becomes a sort of workshop where the United States can try out these imperial techniques that can be used in other places that might be more essential for its economic or security interests. And I think there's obviously quite a lot of element of truth there, and in Nicaragua's case especially, but I do think you have to, and as David Wight emphasizes, you have to emphasize the agency of actors on the other end. And so the United States' activities in Latin America, Nicaragua especially, are determined and set in motion many times by actors in Nicaragua itself. And I actually like David Wight's concept of the cooperative international empire, because there's actually a tremendous amount of cooperation, even, right, and what you see in Nicaragua is, right, even, right, we of course have dictators who are cooperating, but even opponents of dictatorship also cooperate with US empire to try and turn, you even have the Sandinista revolution in its early years, trying to use the United States to build its own revolutionary economy, right? And so I think that's a hallmark of imperial power, that basically all sides in this equation have to turn to the United States as the sort of arbiter of political outcomes on the ground, even though, and the second part of Ben's question about, right, the times for instance, when the US doesn't get what it wants, well, in terms of actual determinate outcomes, the United States, in Nicaragua's case at least, very rarely gets what it wants, right? And so the situation, right, there's often this kind of fantasy of control that policymakers like to have, and you get the rhetoric of Nicaragua being so small and these countries in Central America being so small and powerless. And then there's inevitably this kind of frustration when it never turns out the way anyone plans, and right, everything always goes terribly, terribly wrong. And right, that too, ultimately, right, and this is another hallmark of empire, often ends up serving the interests of the United States in the end, because right, these snafus can be turned to further US interests in lots of complex and ever-evolving ways.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating on that point of just both of your books go up nearly to the present, which is impressive. And yeah, I mean, if we take it to the present moment, you hear a lot of talk today about sort of the decline or the unraveling of the American empire. I'm curious what y'all think, you know, based in terms of your research, do you see a kind of rise and fall, or at least a decline of the American empire in as you move closer to the present, or is that you know, overblown?
Well, I mean, I'll say that there certainly are things that echo in the last decade or so to events in the 70s, which is interesting to me. It stands out in my mind that many people in the 70s thought that the United States was on an inevitable sort of decline, and then you have the triumphalism of the 80s. So just because you're headed in one direction or perceive yourself as heading in one direction does not mean that that's going to inevitably continue to be the case. So, I certainly share that sort of sense. I think in the last decade plus, there's been a real, genuine sense that American power has ebbed a bit. And I think that's largely true. Where that goes into the future, I think, it's undetermined. It's the future, and it depends as much on what the United States does as what other countries do. I mean, it's striking to me, kind of looking over the course of US history, that often its good fortune it's partly US decisions, but it's in many cases more the poor decisions of others that give the United States its openings. So yeah, a lot remains to be seen.
Yeah, I would second the idea that if you look at Central America in particular, forms of overt U.S. intervention are far fewer and far between, given, and the reasons for that I think are up for debate, but certainly there are events like if you're following what's going on in Nicaragua in the present, right? Certainly in the past, the United States would have been hard pressed to pass up an opportunity like the sort of chaos that surrounded the current Ortega regime to intervene more overtly. And certainly there are plenty of things going on behind the scenes, but I think there's a very real reluctance to intervene in the styles of the past. And you could chalk this up to maybe learning from these mistakes, or chalk this up to being preoccupied elsewhere and trying to avoid this kind of image of the heavy-handed northern neighbor. And right, of course, as David Wight puts it, perhaps reserving for events on the ground to take another turn, to feel the need for more overt intervention. So in terms of the ability to intervene, I don't think that has decreased in the slightest. It's just changed its form and taken less overt modes in the last few decades.
So speaking of different forms, I wanted to ask you about culture, because in both of your works, they're not just politics and geopolitics and economics. There's presence of culture. Whether Dr. Wight referred to this, some of the sources he was using, but Dr. Lee, you've got these fascinating sort of poems and novels written by various Nicaraguan intellectuals that you often use to start chapters. And so I was curious, where do you see the role of culture in your book, in your books? Is it primarily about sort of revealing the ways that these broader political economic developments are shaping the societies, or do you see it having a kind of agency of its own? And sorry, Dr. Lee, go ahead. You can go first.
Okay, yeah. So I mentioned in my intro that I spent a lot of time talking about Nicaragua's conservative tradition. These were the primary opponents of the Somoza administration, and they also play a very, very important role in Nicaragua's cultural life. And so they essentially used their outsized role in culture, like poets like Ernesto Cardenal and Pablo Antonio Cuadra, Pedro Joaquin Chamorro, all of these individuals, right, thought of themselves as political actors and as cultural figures. And so, right, their response to many of these problems that I'm trying to understand in the book take the form of engagement through literature, right? They use these works of literature both to try and think through these problems. And so this was helpful to me in trying to understand how actors at the time would have thought about this. They also use it to try and shore up their political legitimacy, right? And so this is what gives them legitimacy as sort of bearers of Nicaragua's national tradition. And they use this kind of nationalism as a means, they use it as a means sometimes to push back against the power of the United States, but also they use it as a kind of protection when they call on that power. And so national sovereignty becomes a really important concept, but one that is very fungible. Basically, at the end of the day, they believe that as the kind of heirs to this national tradition, then they should have both political and cultural autonomy. And so they kind of enact that in the cultural realm. And then this becomes, oftentimes, certainly before the Sandinista revolution, the US government kind of ignored this, and I don't think gave it proper attention, not realizing that there was this massive cultural ferment going on, this nationalist uprising that was going to turn into this revolution, not just of the sort of bearded Cuban revolutionary types, but also of these seemingly staid conservative reactionaries who were also getting fed up with US empire. And it's only in the 1980s during the Contra War that the US government tries to take this cultural nationalism and turn it to its own ends. And figures from the earlier era like Pablo Antonio Cuadra then become associated with US power, and the CIA tries to publish all of his books because now he's this shining figure of the Nicaraguan national essence and not coincidentally a critic of the Sandinista government.
So for myself, I'd say culture is important for two reasons. One is looking at how Americans, Arabs, Iranians created meaning or understandings of how globalization was impacting their societies. But also, I'm concerned with culture as a force of power, or how it intersects with power. And so different cultural narratives are deployed by different political interests to try to further their influence and either expand or restrict US-led petrodollar projects. And so these, anti-Arab narratives in the United States succeed in scaring off Arab investors from large direct investments, because they're worried that there's just so much outcry when they even try to have a small controlling share of very small marginal industries or companies. Similarly, for arms deals to Saudi Arabia, when Saudi Arabia starts to acquire advanced weapons, there's a lot of pushback in the American media, particularly for those in support of Israel. And this often leads to increased arms sales to Israel to counterbalance sales to the Saudis. Similarly, in the Arab world, the Ba'athist regime in Iraq spends a lot of its time, its media propaganda, condemning other Arab countries and Iran under the Shah for having close economic and military ties with the United States, that they're wasting the monies of the Arab people and using it in service of imperialist oppressors. Again, similar narratives being deployed by Islamists in the Arab world in Iran, and that these ultimately will be a carrying force for the Iranian Revolution and pulling Iran out of the US system of empire and becoming a staunch opponent of it in the region. So culture in how it intersects with understandings and power in politics and economics.
Thanks. So let's see, another element I thought was really interesting was, and most recent, David, you were just referring to this, the role of sort of third parties in the relationships between the United States and Nicaragua, or the United States in particular, Middle East and North African states. So Dr. Wight, you have these really fascinating stories about these Saudi arms deals and how they bring in Israel's defenders in the United States, but also how Saudi Arabia sort of convinces reluctant presidents that they need to push hard for these deals, because otherwise they'll have to worry about Iraq or the Soviet Union or Iran or whatever. Yeah, I wonder if you guys could say a little bit more about the role of third parties, or outsiders, to how they shape the relationship between the United States and the topics of your inquiry. Dr. Wight, if you want to go first.
Sure. No, third parties is really important. And one of the things that I like about the book is that in many senses it is a global story. And so you have people involved in this relationship from all around the world. Israel is certainly a prominent example of trying to get in between U.S. ties with the oil-rich Arab countries. Israeli Prime Minister Begin at one point tells Reagan, I'm paraphrasing here, but he literally says that the Jews are not rich like the Arabs, and you can't be giving them all these weapons. We can't keep up on our own. He makes all these arguments about the Saudis being fundamentalists, Islamists, that you say they're anti-communist, but their money then goes to countries like Syria and Iraq, who spend their money buying arms from the Soviets. So making all these arguments to try to disrupt that relationship. Another example would be France, which is trying to get its petrodollars on its own and kind of encroach or break into traditional political and economic relationships, particularly the US-Saudi relationship. When that goes sour for a bit after the 73 war and the Arab oil embargo, the French are jumping in to try to become a new supplier of arms and engineering and everything else. They're hoping to kind of displace the Americans. Vice President Nelson Rockefeller noted he attended the funeral of the Saudi King Faisal in 1975, and the French delegation came with binders of arms that they could sell. And Rockefeller said that the Saudi royal family took that to be in very poor taste at Faisal's funeral. But Rockefeller also noted that it made clear that the Saudis had other options if the United States was not forthcoming on some of the demands that the Saudi government wanted the Americans to move on, whether it was the Arab-Israeli conflict or other issues.
Yeah, well, so for certainly before the revolution in 1979, the U.S. has the predominant influence because, well, Nicaragua wasn't really on the radar of a lot of other countries, although there are these interesting networks of the anti-dictatorial alliance that plays a really important role in the early part of the Alliance for Progress. And so groups of actors who, these are groups of actors who wanted to basically hold the United States to its own stated goals of democratizing the region. But they, of course, very quickly found out that that wasn't the actual goal of much of what was going on. And so their frustration with the mode that US power takes kind of, I think, leads to greater acceptance of these revolutionary alternatives among people who otherwise you wouldn't associate with social revolution. And then, of course, after the revolution in 1979, the FSLN, the Sandinista movement, tries, in order to decenter the power of the United States, tries to reach out to as many actors in the world as possible, of course, immediately for the purpose of gaining aid, right? Trying to replace this massive influence of US foreign aid that's been in Nicaragua for so long, trying to replace it with as many other actors as possible, right? Including, right, socialist states, but also including, right, other Western democracies and other Latin American countries. And this, right, I think does initially give, it gives the revolution some sense of independence, but this is an example of in a way, the US government turning the successes of the revolution against it. It uses, well, it's able to essentially convince European allies, for instance, and many other Latin American countries like Venezuela and lesser extent Mexico, but convince them that their interest is in towing the US line. And so this ends up turning many of these social democratic countries against the revolution and leading greater and greater dependence on Soviet funding by the end of the Contra War, which then, of course, right, legitimates the narrative of the United States that this is simply a power grab for communism. And right, must be destroyed by any means necessary. And so basically the story you get is this often a kind of gravitational pull away, or an attempt to turn away from the power of the United States, but then the United States is always able to pull these recalcitrant actors back into its orbit.
Thanks. That's a great point. I think Paul Kramer has a question. Paul, go ahead.
Yeah, so I was just wondering, kind of a question about research process, and I was wondering for both of you, if there was a particular moment or moments of surprise that you encountered in your research, something where there was an existing assumption that you had, encountered by virtue of the existing literature or your own just expectations and orientation, and something in your research process kind of jolted you and made you really rethink something fundamental that ended up having important implications for your interpretation.
I can start. I started out talking about the reconstruction process after the earthquake in Managua. And this was something that was kind of taken for granted in the literature, that Managua simply had not been reconstructed. Basically, the dictator had stolen all of the money. This is why the city looked, even in the, almost 40 years later, when I was going and visiting, you could still see the legacy of the earthquake. And so it did not look reconstructed in a fundamental way. So it was understandable why people thought that. But I dug into the archives, and it turned out that, well, this had actually been by design. There had been a very well worked out plan, and a lot of money spent on it, much of which, of course, was stolen by the dictator, but there had been an actual plan to this reconstruction process. But it was basically the outcome of the reconstruction that the outcome that the US government was aiming for, that everyone found so distasteful, right? This massively decentralized city, right? There's no longer an urban core anymore, right? Everything, right? When I was being they're trying to turn it into a kind of automotive city, which of course is, and they're segregating it by class and doing all these things that many Nicaraguans, and especially this kind of cultural elite, found immensely distasteful. And so it was that kind of disconnect between the perception and the reality that led me to want to interrogate these concepts, right? I think I saw playing a deeper role in kind of shaping this process, and one that you could often only perceive by digging into archival material and understanding how actors at the time were thinking about what they were doing.
So in my reading, particularly of US and American history, foreign relations work that looks at Khomeini and the Iranian Revolution, there's a very strong tendency to emphasize differences of religion and the sort of religious fundamentalism opposition of Khomeini and his supporters against the US presence. And while that's certainly true, what was striking to me in reading Khomeini's own messages out to his supporters in the lead up and through the revolution and beyond is how often he strikes a very populist, materialist sort of narrative of economic exploitation, and that the economic woes of the Iranian people and the economic sovereignty of the Iranian people is being taken away by the United States. And that this gets kind of underplayed, again, especially in histories of US-Iranian relations. In the histories about Iran, there's usually a bit more attention, amongst Middle East scholars to the populist nature of Khomeini. But even there, the degree that the idea of what we would now kind of call anti-globalization, concern about sovereignty, I think gets kind of underplayed. It's a theme that he just hits over and over again, even in his last will and testament. It's a major theme. And so he really saw this as something that either was really important to him personally, or that galvanized the Iranian people to support him, probably both. And so that was one theme that really was eye-opening to me.
Thanks. Thanks to both of you.
Thanks, Paul. And so to follow up on this idea of things that have been uncovered, one thing I loved about both of the books is you have all of these great stories and details. So let me ask you just to share them with folks who might not have had a chance to read the book yet. So David Wight, if you could go first and tell us about Kuwait and South Carolina and Kiowa Island. I thought that was really surprising and interesting. And then David Lee, maybe you could talk about this. I think he's an American academic who winds up becoming an advocate for indigenous armed rebellion. I thought that was a really interesting story.
Yeah, so in 1974, some Kuwaiti investors come to South Carolina, and in one of the kind of very rare examples of a direct investment, they wanted to buy Kiowa Island and develop a resort and golf course there. It was at the time just natural grounds. It was a natural space. And there was a lot of pushback, both for environmental concerns, but also concerns from the American public about Kuwaiti influence. Some were arguing that they would use the island to stockpile weapons for some sort of nefarious purpose. So a lot of kind of anti-Arab sentiment against this purchase. And the governor of South Carolina, John C. West, he was a great advocate for investments in his state. He had previously largely dealt with Western Europeans and Japanese, but when the Kuwaitis come, he saw this as a great new zone of potential. And he fights really hard for this deal. And he also coordinates with the Kuwaiti royalty, the royal family, the crown prince. He advises them and connects them to get in touch with American PR firms to try to kind of launch a PR blitz to soften opposition, which they do. And this is ultimately how the resort at Kiowa Island gets made by the Kuwaitis and John C. West. And West would go on to be a big advocate of U.S. Arab petrodollar ties. He would lead a lot of trade campaigns for not just South Carolina, but the American South more broadly. And ultimately, this led him to become ambassador for the United States to Saudi Arabia under the Carter administration. So he had previously, West had previously had no obvious ties or interests in the Arab world. Kuwaiti investors come to his state, and it kind of changes the trajectory of his life.
Yeah, so the figure Ben asked about, I think he's referring to an American geographer named Bernard Nichman from University of California, Berkeley. This is another kind of archival find that I just stumbled upon. I vaguely knew who he was, and then his papers, I was able to open up his papers in the Bancroft Library and was like, oh my God, this is wild. So basically he was a geographer who studied indigenous turtle fishing practices in the 60s and early 70s on the Mosquito Coast. And the Mosquitos are an indigenous group in Nicaragua. So he worked down there for a long time. And then when the revolution happens, you may know the Mosquito Indians, many of them didn't really like the direction the revolution was taking. And so they tried to invite sympathetic foreigners. And this is another example of the sort of third parties that we were talking about earlier, sympathetic foreigners to come in and as either human rights observers or to basically kind of stand in between them and the government in Managua that they thought was impinging on indigenous autonomy. And so Nichman comes in and becomes this very vocal advocate of the Mosquito movement and a very vocal anti-Sandinista advocate, and tries to court the Reagan administration and tries to convince the Reagan administration to give up the Contra movement. Those guys aren't the real revolutionaries. What we really need to do is arm indigenous people. And then we need to not just arm the Mosquito Indians, but well, we might as well go ahead and arm the rest of the indigenous groups in Central America. And we can create this kind of political and ecological utopia. And so he tries to connect armed indigenous autonomy with environmental sustainability and argues that this can only be built on the armed power of these indigenous groups. And so this is also a case of kind of, you sometimes you have to be aware of your enemies, but also of your allies, because while some of these indigenous political actors they welcomed the attention and welcomed the assistance from abroad, but right, for instance, when they started trying to negotiate a ceasefire with the Sandinistas, many of these foreign advocates were like, no, this is a betrayal of the cause. You have to, right, you need to keep revolting against the government, otherwise we're going to lose this much grander utopian picture. And so, right, in some ways, this, I think, the outside influence makes the conflict on the East Coast worse in a lot of ways, and makes it more difficult to come up with a compromise. Although eventually, after everything is said and done, they do finally hash out a kind of autonomy agreement that is, in some ways, a sort of precursor to a lot of later autonomy regimes in Latin America.
Yeah, and there's also the side story of Nichman's associate who sort of uncovers Noriega's role in the drug trade and then goes and tries to investigate and is like tortured and executed.
Right. Hugo Spadafora, who was a doctor and a sort of quasi Che Guevara figure who liked to go and assist revolutionary movements. He had spent time in West Africa, and he's a Panamanian doctor and works with the Contras, but then he's upset because, right, he has this kind of utopian ideal that the Contra movement, surprisingly enough, that the Contra movement could be a sort of utopian movement, and is angry that Noriega is using it to funnel drug money and all these things. And he goes back to Panama and is brutally murdered and executed by Noriega, which, yeah.
Sorry, Dr. Wight, when I read the part about Kiowa Island, it made me think that this summer my family and I went to Bald Head Island, which is not far from there. And I learned that it was purchased in the 1980s by this Texas family who were, I guess, some of the first hydrofrackers. And so it made me think there's maybe a history of like petrodollar development of Carolina barrier islands that should be written, and perhaps would be an excuse to get funding to, go to the beach repeatedly. So maybe that's my third book project.
I like that.
Well, I have a couple more questions, but I thought I would invite, if either of the panelists, if you wanted to ask a question of each other, we could do that now, or else I'm happy to continue. Well, I'll take that as an invitation to ask another question. Well, let me ask about sources. I mean, so both of these books, again, the main coverage sort of goes into the late 80s and early 90s, and then the epilogue, you can take it down to near the present day. But even, I think the 80s and 90s are kind of the frontier of archival availability. And so I wondered if you could say a little bit about, which sources are available, both whether in physical manuscript form or online, and sort of what you found useful, what you wished was open, what might be opening soon, what the limitations of research in this time period might be. David Wight, why don't you start off?
Yeah, by the time you get to the 80s, certainly the official documentary record is more mixed. I guess one of the factors is whether the country in the Middle East is friendly or has an existing government from that period now today compared to the 80s. So there's a lot of material that's available for, say, Libya or Iraq. There's far less for communications with, say, like Saudi Arabia or operations in Afghanistan, at least when I was doing the research. So I would have liked to have seen more on those topics, particularly the campaign for the United States to support the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. I would have been curious to see more records about that while I was doing researching. There's been good journalistic work on that, and some emerging scholarship by historians in the last couple of years. But especially for the 80s. At least when I was doing the research, there was not too much open yet. So yeah, it was definitely a mixed bag.
Yeah, some similar problem. I would say that one of the benefits of studying development is that development agencies sometimes have, like USAID, sometimes have more information available than State Department archives and other sort of more security-oriented agencies. But even then, right, by the time you get to the 80s and 90s, information becomes much thinner. And so I often depended on either kind of lucky archival finds, like the scholars' personal papers that I mentioned earlier that just happened to be available. Very fortunate, the Socialist International papers in Amsterdam are pretty open and dealt quite explicitly with a lot of the issues that I wanted to deal with in the 1980s. And so that certainly shaped my narrative in a fundamental way. And yeah, right. So in a way, certainly the more recent you get, the narrative you can tell often gets shaped by the archival sources that are available versus going and wanting to look for something very specific, and then you kind of end up shaping the narrative around what you can actually find.
So I guess for a last question, we have about 5 minutes left. Were there questions? I mean, David Wight, you just mentioned, you wish you could have found out sort of more about the funding for the war in Afghanistan, or the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. Were there is there another question that you weren't able to answer for this book that you hope either you or someone else could pick up and run with in the future? David Lee, you want to go first?
So, well, I was recently talking to a friend about the book, and he would kind of pick up on different themes, and virtually every theme he picked up, I was like, oh yeah, somebody should write a book about that. That'd be a great book in and of itself. And so, yeah, there are many cases that need to be pursued further. One that I wanted to pursue and haven't, partly because of lack of archival material that is open yet, because it becomes more important in the 80s and 90s, the issue of ideologies of race. And I talk about this a little bit in relation to the indigenous struggle and Nicaragua's East Coast, but the concept of mestizaje, I actually discovered this is another place of genuine surprise in the archive, that US officials were actually very keen on this idea of mestizaje, or race mixture, that is key to Latin American national identity, and hoped to kind of utilize that as a way of building these integrated societies that they were trying to build. And certainly there's a long literature in Latin American studies about this at the national level, but I think there's a lot more interesting work to be done on understanding this ideas about race and ethnicity as tools of the US government itself, which I think becomes more explicit later on in the 1980s and 1990s as these various ethnic movements, indigenous autonomy movements become more prominent and call into question this whole ideal of this coherent unified nation state.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of different areas that still a lot of promising, opportunity for further work. One that stood out to me was the Latin American debt crisis of the 1980s and the response to it. Much of the private lending to Latin America is being funded by petrodollars, and this ultimately becomes unsustainable for a variety of reasons. But then how the United States, the IMF, kind of responds to that crisis and restructures the economies there, sort of thinking behind the scenes, actions, how this gets negotiated. I think there's still a lot that remains to be told. There's certainly historians who are underway with projects on this. So I'm looking forward to learning much more about that in the future.
Yeah, and so overlap with our books. I liked the emphasis on petrodollars as a sort of behind the scenes force in the Contra War, which I of course was aware of, but hadn't quite put two and two together with everything else that was going on. So that was a very interesting corrective.
Well, and the
Thank you.
fact that Venezuelan oil becomes important at the end, and there's that big lighted up portrait of
Hugo
Hugo
Chavez and
Chavez.
lights,
Yeah,
yeah.
is that still there?
As far as I know, last time I was there, yeah.
Great. Well, we've reached basically 1 o'clock, so I will wrap things up and just thank both of our presenters, authors. I learned a lot from reading your books, and I've learned more from having the opportunity to discuss this with you. If anyone in the audience has further questions, feel free. You can email David Lee or David Wight. Thank you all for coming, and hope you all learned as much as I did.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks, everybody.